Welcome to the Quillette podcast. I'm Jonathan Kay, just back from a week in Brooklyn where I attended the Heterodox Academy annual conference. Heterodox Academy, as many of you know, is a nonpartisan organization for academics who want to protect open inquiry, intellectual pluralism, viewpoint diversity, and a spirit of constructive debate on university campuses. Among its original creators was Jonathan Haidt, who many of you will know as the co-author of the famous book, The Coddling of the American Mind. In past years, Heterodox Academy conferences have examined the question of how to push back effectively against demands for ideological conformity from dogmatic progressives. But more recently, as many speakers in Brooklyn took pains to emphasize, we're starting to see illiberal pressures coming from the right side of the political spectrum. In part, this is simply because the culture war is cyclical, and left-wing overreach on issues related to race and gender were bound to eventually awaken a vigorous counterattack from conservatives and principled classical liberals. But of course, the phenomenon is also tied up with the election of Donald Trump, who's used his federal government powers to pressure, some would say bully, universities to align their DEI policies with his demands. Another notable development at Heterodox Academy in recent years has been the emergence of different sub-communities that correspond to different areas and academic specialties. These have names like HX Anthropology, HX Canada, and HX Philosophy. And in my opinion, the conference sessions devoted to these specialties were some of the most interesting events that I attended. This included a session dedicated to scholars in the field of social work, which is how I met this week's guest, Dr. Nafees Alam, an associate professor in the Department of Social Work at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. As Professor Alam told the audience in Brooklyn, and as he'll discuss in more detail in our conversation, the field of social work is full of well-intentioned professionals trying to do the right thing, often in difficult circumstances and with limited resources. Unfortunately, the definition of what constitutes the right thing can easily be distorted by political and ideological factors, including a fixation on markers of group identity, which, as Professor Alam stresses, often has little to do with the individual circumstances of the people in need whom social workers are mandated to assist. Over time, Professor Alam has become concerned about the intrusion of ideological dogmas into the social work education field, which is why he's taken on a leadership role in creating the Heterodox Academy social work community. He's also recently committed his views to a scholarly paper published in the journal Research on Social Work Practice, co-authored with his University of Nebraska colleague Heidi Roetta. That paper is entitled Heterodox Social Work: Advancing Viewpoint Diversity, Constructive Disagreement, and Open Inquiry. And just one editorial note, during our discussion, you'll hear me make reference to remarks delivered by one of Professor Alam's co-panelists in Brooklyn, but without naming her. That scholar is Tiffany Jones, a quantitative research specialist who lectures on social work at Howard University. And now, my interview with Nafees Alam, associate professor in the Department of Social Work at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Nafees Alam, thanks so much for joining the Quillette podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, so I have to admit this is the first podcast we've done on the field of social work, never mind heterodox social work. We haven't even done orthodox social work, so we're playing catch up here. I think a lot of people know of social work as a government service. They don't know a lot about the academic aspect of it. Would it be fair to say that the majority of people enrolled in social work programs at universities are destined to work for one level of government to the other?
Either directly or indirectly, yes. So there are a number of private agencies in addition to public agencies that employ social workers. Hospitals employ social workers. And in fact, social work is bleeding over into the corporate space. My research specialty is sports social work. And so we work with athletes and we use sport as social work interventions as well. So there's a number of areas that social workers can get into.
What would a sports social work context look like?
Well, working with athletes, not different from sports psychology in that sports psychology focuses on the athlete being the best athlete that they can be, whereas sports social workers, we would focus on the athlete being the best person that they can be. So that includes family therapy, group counseling, not so much concerned with their sport of choice, but rather making sure that they are living their best lives, the best version of their lives, whatever that means to them.
Is this kind of blurring into psychology and what's often called life coaching?
I don't know that it is because sports psychology is about the athlete figuring out how to be the best athlete that they can be. Sports social work is not about that necessarily, although certainly if things are good at home, then they should be good on the field or the court as well. But we focus specifically on the societal areas.
What percentage of a typical graduating class would get a job with the government where they're assisting at need families, people experiencing poverty, social marginalization, child services, that sort of thing?
I would know the exact percentages, but I would say the majority of
Okay.
graduates wouldn't find themselves in sports social work. It's very niche. But either working for a hospital, a public organization, a private organization, whether that's child welfare, elderly care, respite care, that would be the majority of social work graduates. Yeah.
Because you're obviously an academic in the field, maybe you can help us with the history here. My layperson sense is that a lot of the functions done by social workers, maybe if you go back a century or more, they were done by religious charitable institutions,
hmm
local civic groups. When did social work become an academic discipline? Like when you're looking at the citations to some of the sort of the original texts,
hmm
what historical period do they date from?
I usually seminal articles I'll take from the 70s and the 80s.
Okay.
Um, that would be essentially the start of modern social work, I would say. Anything prior to that doesn't really touch on social work as much, so I don't find myself citing those articles as much in my research.
So things have always been ideological, even if every generation feels they're more ideological than the generation before. So I'm older than you, and I remember, the late Cold War period. There was this, and this got into the Bill Clinton years. There was this argument about things like welfare reform and single motherhood. There's this whole subplot involving the sitcom Murphy Brown, which I don't expect you to be familiar with, where conservatives and what were then called liberals would argue about what I guess we still call the root causes of people experiencing poverty and all that sort of thing. And it was ideological even then. And the idea was that welfare causes family dysfunction because you're giving people money for free and you're destroying their work ethic and that sort of thing. Is it fair to say that social work has always been political to some extent?
I suppose it has, and you're touching on the Thomas Sowell perspective of how welfare negatively impacts those who receive it. And yeah, it's the answer to that question would be yes.
Conservatives would talk about so-called welfare queens, the idea of this stereotype of a woman just collecting checks and people would have kids just to get money. I doubt there was much truth to that, but um, at that time, at least, it was conservatives who were sort of politicizing it. I guess politicizing the very existence of a thick social safety net. So I just read your paper, Heterodox Social Work, Advancing Viewpoint Diversity, Constructive Disagreement, and Open Inquiry, which you co-authored with, if I'm pronouncing her name right, Heidi Rueda.
Heidi Rueda, yes.
Okay. And the point you make here is that the dominant ideological school of thought in the field now very much swings in the other direction. If you could summarize the dominant ideological viewpoint in the academy in regard to social work, how would you describe it?
I would say it is focused on groups and demographics. There's a tendency, and this is the gripe that I have with it, right? There's a tendency to think that your demographic variables predominantly determine who you are. If we were to talk about Martin Luther King and content of character versus color of skin, extrapolated, the color of skin could be externally present demographics like race, gender, sexuality, and content of character would be the things that we think about that make us so unique. And so the dominant perspective at least in my opinion, tends to be, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, including my co-author. So speaking for myself, I've noticed that uh, the dominant perspective seems to be that the color of skin, those external demographics, uh, define someone's content of character, which is problematic, certainly.
Could you give me an example about how that framework would be applied in the day-to-day work of a social worker?
Well, if I could use myself as an example, this isn't some sick tan. I am an ethnic minority. I was born in Libya, grew up in Bangladesh, and there would likely be a tendency to think that since I am an immigrant to the United States, that my story must be one of poverty, or is more likely to be one of poverty, of started from the bottom, now we're here type of Drake situation. However, people are often surprised to find that my parents were not they were fairly affluent, both in Libya and in Bangladesh. We came to the United States as winners of the visa lottery, which there are some issues there, but that's a different story for a different day. But in doing so, both my parents came in with employment. And many folks are surprised to find that. I'm like, well, your immigrant story does not fit the immigrant story, and thus somehow my immigrant story is less legitimate. I wonder about that, and I question that.
If I can extrapolate from that, would it be fair to say that if you were somebody like you who found yourself in need of the services provided by social workers, you might expect that their first impulse would be to see how your status as an immigrant had shaped, say, the discrimination you had faced or lack of access to services, or maybe they might assume that you had problems with English. Obviously, you don't have problems with English.
They usually do, and I do have problems with English since English is my fourth language.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you hear me saying a lot or stuttering, which you might edit out, that would be one of the reasons why. So Bengali is my first language. Second language is Arabic because my mom is Islamic and we had to read the Quran. And my mom also liked Hindi movies, Bollywood movies growing up. So Hindi was my third language. And then when we came to America when I was 7, I started learning English. But yeah, to answer your question, there is a tendency to think that, because of the way that I look and because of the story that is associated with that, Bangladesh is a poorer country, and so us coming to America, the assumption would be that, oh, you must need all of the social services, you must not have anything going on, you must need help with employment and education and learning. While we needed some help, certainly all immigrants do to assimilate to the nation that they're migrating or immigrating to. Um, our story was a little bit different than what many social workers would see as the general immigrant story.
Totally get what you're saying in terms of expectations about immigrants. I have a Sri Lankan born friend here in Toronto, and he moved to Vancouver and lived there and worked there for a quarter century. And he jokes that when he moved out there, he saw a lot of, this is his language, brown guys mowing the lawns of white guys, and when he left, it was white guys mowing the lawns of brown guys. He's allowed to talk like that, by the way. I'm just quoting him.
Yeah.
Uh, but if you go to Vancouver, you find like that's obviously simplified, but there's wealthy Asians and South Asians and East Asians and plenty of wealthy Russians and plain old regular Canadians of every color too. However, there is a grain of truth to some of this groupthink. Let me just give you an example here from Canada. I realize you're talking to me from Nebraska. So in Canada, as you probably know, Indigenous Canadians face a disproportionate number of challenges, socioeconomic. Life on reserves, somewhat analogous to American Indian reservations, but with their own unique problems too. There's a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment. A lot of it is rooted in some of the historical crimes that were committed against Indigenous peoples. There is unfortunately a tragic sameness to many of the problems that these people confront, including a tragic sameness to some of the problems that they confront when they move from sometimes rural, remote reservations to the big city. I think one Indigenous person told me that if you move from Hong Kong to Toronto, that is not as big a culture shift as moving from a remote Indigenous fly-in reserve to Toronto. that it's a bigger culture gap within Canada. And so as a result, there have been a lot of cases where, you have white child services workers, white social workers, white government bureaucrats who are dealing often sympathetically with Indigenous people in situations where they do require help, government services. And there might be a certain uniformity of experience and of challenge that they face. And maybe somebody who is in what you describe as the orthodox school of social work would say assumptions sometimes that we make about racism that they faced or poverty that they're experiencing, those are warranted. Maybe the same is true of some maybe Black communities in the United States that have faced a lot of marginalization and urban ghettos, if I'm still allowed to use that term. Is there a grain of truth to some of the reductionist group-based beliefs?
There is, but you know, 80% does not equal 100%. And my issue is not that, because we have to start with demographics. We get an intake file before we ever get to meet our clients. So, yeah, assumptions will be made. But I'm talking about that other 20% where why is it that individual Black people or brown people like myself are not generally allowed to fall outside of expectations when it comes to our experience?
Well, you use the term intake file. Can you tell people what an intake file looks like for a typical social worker?
Yeah, it depends on the services specifically. But when I worked at New York Foundling Hospital, it was name, ages of the family members, the presenting issues. Sometimes it might be educational neglect when a student has been missing school X amount of times throughout the academic year. Oftentimes, we'll get a criminal history if there is one of the parents. We'll get the family demographics, whether or not the parents are married, if there are additional step parents or parents living outside of the home involved. Just a quick synopsis of what we're going to be walking into. Oh, this is an important thing too, is if there's a pet. Some folks are like myself, very afraid of dogs, and some are allergic to cats. So we'll get some information related to pets, but that's what an intake file is. It's a uh, the initial introduction to the home that you're going to be walking into. And the function of that intake file is to make sure that you see all of the children that are listed there. So if there are 5 children listed there and you walk in and you only see 4, and they say that there are only 4, then that would be a further investigation of like what happened to the 5th. Is that a misprint, or does that child not live there, or is there something different going on?
A social worker walks into a home like that after looking at the intake file. This is an ignorant question I'm going to ask, and I think a lot of my listeners probably don't know. What percentage of those households want that social worker inside the household?
Hmm. That's a hard question to answer because we have mandated services, in which case 0. If it's court appointed, then they don't want you there.
But you started with an interesting scenario where you said it was at a hospital that often you were presented with this case. Is that because somebody came in with like chronic issues and an administrator said, you have health issues, but you also have underlying social issues, and you get pushed into a kind of social work context?
That could be the case, but what I was thinking about specifically was an example where a child came in with bruises that seemed to be where they're being gripped in a certain kind of
Mm-hmm.
way. So investigating whether or not that was something that was inappropriate punishment, inappropriate discipline. I should also mention many times, social workers will go in and find that, it's not as bad as what it seems. But that's another function of social workers, is that, if things are good, then that's good. Like we've validated that. But it's also important to have an eye on what's going on in case there is something worse.
Every once in a while in Canada, I'm sure it's the same in the United States, you get these horrible stories about, a child dies or is severely injured or something, and sometimes, the third or fourth paragraph of the story, it's a social worker visited the house 3 weeks earlier and said everything was fine. And I'm guessing nobody wants to be that social worker.
Mm.
So is there a kind of morbid fear of false negatives, in the sense that you're from a professional point of view, and maybe from a humanitarian point of view too, you're willing to risk false positives, sort of maybe raising alarm or concern about marginal indicators just because you're so terrified that you'll be the social worker who walks out of that apartment and then a couple weeks later you find out something tragic happened?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes, but I don't know that there's research done on it. But common sense would say, like, there was a
Well, you've been in, I mean, you've been in this situation. Like, is that something that entered your mind? I know it would be in my mind.
100%, 100%. It's been because if there are questions, I don't want the answer to be Nafees is a terrible social worker. And
And sometimes it could be you made the right decision. You looked at the indicators and say, on a balance of probabilities, I really don't see a risk here. And just, unfortunately, a lot of life is a lottery.
I practiced in New York City where you and I met. And so, a long time ago, there was a case, Nix Mary Brown, where a child died and a social worker was making or fabricating visits to the home.
No. Oh,
Yeah.
that's horrible.
Yeah. And so, the response by many social work, ACS, Administration for Children's Services, was that, okay, we're going to err on the side of overcorrecting. So there was a point in time and during that period of time where we would remove children if we had any questions, and we would return them if the questions were answered in the proper way. But it does seem sometimes like social workers may be playing defense. So
I can't imagine. I mean, to be a parent and say, well, we're even temporarily removing the child is I can't imagine the scenes that must.
oh my goodness. I mean, I've done a number of removals myself back in the day. And, I don't care how strong you are emotionally, you can't not break down.
Well, some of those stories. I mean, obviously, you're not going to name names, but in anonymized form, could you maybe talk about what that experience is like? For that reason alone, I could never be in the field. I wouldn't have the strength
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah, I would show up, and things might have changed. It's been, over a decade since I've practiced at the hospital, but I would show up at a home. The parent would be notified that there is a removal going on, and oftentimes they would cooperate because they know we're all on the same team trying to get to reunification. I would show up, and a police officer would be there with me to make sure that I'm not in danger, the child's not in danger, the parent isn't in danger, and the child, this in this example, it was a 3-year-old. It's so difficult to speak with, but told the 3-year-old, listen, you have to give your mama goodbye hug. You're going to come with me. She packed your stuff up and we're going to go. And, I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to you. You're going to see your mom again soon. And the child would break down, look to mom, obviously, because that's the emotional connection to the world. And the mom in this example was just so strong and saying, yeah, baby, you're going to be okay. You're just going to go with him. He's a good person. You've met him before. He's come to the house before, and this is the decision that needs to be made. And of course, the child is going to break down. And so, I held the hand of the child, took her to the car, put her in the car seat. Now she is crying, as hard as you could imagine. And the mom was there too, trying to comfort the child. It's still her child, whether the child is being removed or not. It's still her child. And so I remember driving the police officer. We shook hands because the removal had already taken place. Shook the mom's hand, closed the door, and really, told her, "Thank you for making this as easy as possible on your child. This is exactly what happens." And I remember driving back to work, about a 10-15 minute drive, one hand on the wheel and the other hand like holding the hand of the child behind me in the car seat. And she was crying, continued to cry. And I just told her, and this is, different social workers differ, but I told her, cry. Like, if that's what you're feeling, cry, and I told her, to the extent of that a 3-year-old could understand, this is what I would do too. And you just cry it out. And we get to the office. And I take her hand again. We go upstairs. There's a child care place and room right there, but she wanted to stay with me because, although I'm not a good guy in this case, in this scenario, I am a familiar person. So she wanted to sit in the desk next to the work that I was doing, and I was working on my computer trying to find kinship placement for this child. And I was able to find two aunts that lived together. This was about an hour and a half away. And I told her that this is where we'd be going. And at this point, she had calmed down. She was smiling. She was playing. We have toys, obviously, to play with, and chicken nuggets that she wasn't eating. And I was asking her to eat over and over again. And so then Once we had the kinship placement, I put her back in the car. I drove her to her aunt's house. And as I was doing the home survey to make sure that the facilities are there for the child to be there for at least a couple of weeks, as I was going back to the car, I remember the child saying, "Don't go, don't go," and she started crying. And part of me got real curious and like, what's going on here? Is there something wrong with the aunts? And I called my director back in the office and said, "So this is what's going on right now. Help me understand what it is. Is there any sort of criminal history, any sort of background that may be any level of red flag there?" And my director mentioned to me, "No, no, that's not what's going on here. The child has bonded to you over
Mm.
the last 5 or 6 hours. You went from being the bad guy to the only person that she can connect with for these last 5 hours." And the child continues to come, stay, stay. There's spaghetti. They always have spaghetti here. They always have toys that we can play with. We can get chicken nuggets because you love
Mm.
chicken nuggets. And I didn't have
Mm.
any of those chicken nuggets. But, as I left, I remember driving away thinking, wow, so this is a real life example of a trauma bond happening within just 5 hours. And then the aunts brought the kid back in a couple days later, and I saw the child. And at that point, the child did not want anything to do with me. The child was very bonded to the aunts now, and now when she looked at me, she looked at me with fear. So it was a whole emotional roller.
Which is not, it's not great that she looks at you with fear, but it is good that she's bonded with her aunts.
Yeah,
Okay, so thank you for telling me that story because I think that provides a lot of context for what we're talking about. If we can revisit the events you just said, how would an ideologically programmed social work education change the way you dealt with that situation, if at all? At what decision points would maybe some of the ideological monoculture in universities, which we're going to talk about more, would it interject itself in a way that maybe stripped away some of the like individual details and flexibility that you need in that kind of situation?
I wonder if race had a factor in it. This was a white family,
Mm.
and so
So in a way, it's like from an ideological point of view, a little bit of like sort of man bites dog is it's kind of stripped of some of the oppressor oppressive dynamics that maybe you talk about in your article. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I would think that would be true. Although if this was a black family, I imagine there would be uh, questions as to whether or not race played a factor. I wonder about that.
Speaking of which, we do see statistics here in Canada which say things like, well, for instance, with schools that X percentage of black students who commit disciplinary infractions get suspended, and Y percent, a lower percentage of white students who commit the same infractions get suspended. I'm guessing during university education, social workers are sometimes presented with the same kind of statistics.
My question would be as to what are some other variables that could help us understand why that is the case. Now,
Well, you talk about that in your article, although you use, I don't think euphemism is the right term, but you say, unlike critical perspectives that prioritize equality of outcome and group-based identity analyses, classical liberal scholarship maintains that disparate outcomes require rigorous scientific investigation before attributing causality to social structures. So attributing causality to social structures, that's academic jargon, but in layperson's language, that's kind of means like you're blaming the system.
blaming the system or blaming the demographics.
This is a regulated field, and I learned this during your presentation in Brooklyn. You talk about the Code of Ethics promulgated by the National Association of Social Workers. It guides social workers to demonstrate awareness by understanding our own biases and engaging in self correction, recognizing clients as experts of their own culture, committing to lifelong learning, and holding institutions accountable for advancing cultural humility. That actually sounds good. Do you agree with that?
I do, because it places the onus on the individual and not the group that the individual belongs to.
But then you make the point, well, this is my language, where for all the humility and introspection you're supposed to exhibit, that same introspection is not applied in a way that makes you examine whether you've glommed on to some kind of ideological meta theory that maybe isn't applicable to all cases. So you say numerous studies have described how the social work classroom has alienated or even belittled students with moderate or conservative political leanings. But then you actually show data that says it's not as if social work is entirely 100% people who are dyed-in-the-wool progressives. The data suggests that there's a fair number of a quarter, there's a survey, 23.5% were moderate. You had 7% are conservatives, not a lot, but 35% of licensed clinical social workers consider themselves very religious or moderately religious. So it sounds like the commanding heights of the field academically are not representative of the rank and file. Is that the case?
I would say so, because there appears to be a lack of acknowledgement of the diversity that exists within social workers. As you mentioned, we are fairly diverse intellectually and ideologically. However, the general public's perception, in addition to which is actually supported by many of the organizational decisions that are made, uh, tend to make it seem as though we are an orthodoxy, that we are a monolith, and we're not.
At the Heterodox Academy panel where you spoke, you said in passing that you actually have had a huge amount of take up on the heterodox social work subgroup that I think you helped create, which suggests there's a big appetite for this.
Almost 100 members now, and after this presentation, I'm sure we've gotten a lot more. I'm just catching it.
And after this interview, I mean, get set for thousands, right?
Yeah.
Your co-panelist, I believe she was a statistician within the social work field. She was talking about the reasons people get into social work and the kind of social roles they adopt. And she told this story, which is just so cringy, where like she happens to be a Black woman, from what I could tell, and she was giving a lecture, and a woman. This is a story she was telling, and one of her students, who from context sounds like the student was white, came up to her and gave like a Black Power salute and said, "I'm your ally." Which, I mean, to be fair to this poor white woman, I'm sure she thought she was doing the right thing and being nice, but this social worker and academic who was speaking about the experience at Heterodox Academy was kind of like horrified by it. She was like, I'm your professor. I didn't come here for validation or for your allyship. Like, that's not an appropriate thing for you to say to a professor. It's kind of condescending in a way. And then we got into a larger discussion about why people get into the field. And I guess maybe some people listening to this podcast could think, oh, it's just like kind of a bunch of white women who have Florence Nightingale syndrome, and it's like this self-valorizing thing where they want to see them. But I got the sense it was more complicated. The real answer is more complicated. She said that a lot of people get into the field because they have their own trauma, and they don't want people to go through the same trauma. Is that your experience? And can you comment on how that shapes the politics of the field?
Well, it's my experience as well. One of the reasons why I got into social work is because of the sport social work piece. Sports did not work out for me due to a number of injuries, and that was my identity growing up. And it was a.
Are you like a martial artist or something? Or
I'm a boxer now, but I used to be a football player.
okay,
So I'm not athletic, just very aggressive and
all right,
a
okay,
little larger
yeah,
than maybe I should be. But so when sports didn't work out for me, a social worker helped me navigate an identity shift into
okay.
academia, into being what I consider to be an intellectual. I don't know if others would think of me as one, but yeah, that's my personal story. And one of the reasons why I work with athletes now um, is because of the experience that I had. So yeah, that certainly does play a factor.
Your co-panelists made a very interesting point, talking about the sense of hubris that a lot of students bring, where yes, they're enrolled in a social work program, but in the back of their mind is kind of the unstated premise, like, I already know how to do this. Um, and the way to do this is coincidentally aligns with implementing all these political slogans they see on Twitter. On one hand, they're exhibiting all this kind of like humility and allyship, and I'm the oppressor, and this, but it's kind of paradoxical because despite that posture of self-abasement, really they think of themselves as very politically enlightened even before they take the first day of lectures. How do you find your core of students is? Like, do you have a lot of deprogramming you have to do, and or at least bashing expectations that people bring into the classroom on their first day of lectures?
I do, and I think me presenting the way that I do is helpful in that.
Like, what's the biggest misconception that a lot of these first year students come to social work with?
Um, from a racial perspective, that those who are black or brown uh, must have worse experiences in America than white people. And so, I often start with my own story of how we came to the United States, fairly privileged, fairly affluent, and students tend to be surprised by that. And I think that's where the deprogramming begins. Sometimes, where they see someone, a real human being, talking and speaking in a different way than you were taught to think about black or brown people per se.
Toward the end of your article, you talk about more specific policy issues. So here's a line: students could be tasked with debating the merits and limitations of different policy approaches to homelessness, such as housing first models versus work requirement programs. I happen to be familiar a little bit with the background here. I know that there is a school of thought that says if a person has mental health issues, drug issues, sometimes the best thing to do, give them a place to live, to call their own, and then deal with the other issue. Because when a person has a place to live, all the other issues become easier to deal with. I got the sense, I inferred from the way you said this, that is it taboo to question the housing first model now in social work classes?
In some classes, certainly,
Yeah.
not in mine, obviously, but yeah, in many cases, questioning the status quo is seen as something.
I mean, and in terms of the state of research, is the jury still out on the housing first model? I don't know.
I would say yes. I mean,
Okay.
but the state of research would suggest that the jury is still out on everything, because every article ends with more research needs to be done on this before making sweeping changes. In fact, I don't know of any good article that doesn't at least acknowledge that to a certain extent. But yeah, and the perspectives and opinions might change based on who you're talking to and what state you're in as well.
I want to talk about police. So as a journalist, I've done ride-alongs with police, and so many of the calls that I was riding along with blurred into social work. Pull up at a house, and the officer would say, "Well, we've been to this house 30 times this year. There's an older child who's very autistic and can get violent. He's not a threat to officers, but he smashes walls, and the parents are older and they get alarmed." What often happens is the police are there for 5 or 10 minutes, and then the call goes out to social workers. And so there's all these programs where it sort of combines social workers with police. But the common denominator in many cases, and you talked about this in the story about the 3-year-old who got taken away, is often the officer is there in the background to make sure everything is safe. But one of the dominant ideological precepts in progressive thought, including on university campuses, has been like the police are always bad. But in the social work case, you're dealing with the police all the time. They're there to kind of protect you, or the police call you, or you call the police. You've been in this domain during this entire ideological controversy over like defund the police, get rid of the police.
Mhm.
In 2020, there was a lot of radicalism around this. How did your field deal with that?
We were mixed, because I have colleagues that were in favor of defunding the police completely. And, in those Facebook forums and places like that, my response would be, well, what would happen to the clients that we work with? Those living in dangerous neighborhoods already, where there's gunfire back and forth every, couple of weeks. If the police were not there, do you think things will get better or would they get worse? And I think, there are certainly situations and circumstances where a social worker would be a better fit to address something than a police officer, because when you wear that uniform and you're strapped with that weapon, it might give an impression of being intimidated, certainly. But I think the public perception of police have not been helped by many social workers and many psychologists and sociologists and related fields. Police are there to help us stay safe and to protect us from danger. When the police are seen as the danger, and we call for them to not be present when there is danger, then who's going to protect us?
As we were talking about before, you have this huge influx of people in your field who are looking to support the possibility of having heterodox dialogues in social work. You keep coming back to this NASW code of ethics. Notwithstanding all these conversations that you and your colleagues are having, is it the case that what really needs to change is the language contained in this code of ethics?
Yes, but at the same time, within that document is also the acknowledgement of political belief as an area of diversity. Now, the
Okay.
NASW Code of Ethics, uh, within the Code of Ethics, it states that it does not give guidance as to how the Code of Ethics should be applied, just that these are the Code of Ethics. And it needs to be noted and stated that it's not so much the code of ethics itself, but those who have the freedom to apply the code of ethics in the way that they envision them to be stated. That's where I think we need to address the deficiencies.
There's another document, the Educational Policy and Accreditation Standards.
Yep, CSW.
You describe these more explicitly as stifling of critical and open debate. You write that anti-oppressive and anti-racist ideologies are mandated by the EPAS. What role does the EPAS play in governing how social workers conduct themselves?
Social work education. So the
Got
CSWE
it.
is the Council on Social Work Education. That is the accrediting body of universities teaching social work. And so,
So that's interesting. So is it the case that you have this more doctrinaire formulation about how social justice stuff has to be encoded in social work within the educational mandate than the actual code of ethics governing people who are practicing social
well,
work?
that's not even subjective, it's objective because
Interesting.
within the EPAS, the CSWE EPAS, anti racism is written in.
So that's okay. That's interesting. And it just anecdotally, we see this in the educational field because here in Canada, the some of the teachers' colleges, particularly, it's called OISE, University of Toronto. It's one of the top teachers' colleges, basically in Canada, and it's become extremely radicalized ideologically. And yet, I've had three daughters go through public elementary schools, and the teachers were fine. They were fine because they were working in a real life context, and whatever they learned at OISE, they're professionals, and when they see that their kids need a more flexible approach, which isn't ideologically mandated, um, they follow their instincts, and they're good teachers. So it sounds like this is a pattern you see in a lot of fields where people who stay in the academy, I guess that includes you, are more at risk of sort of herd mentality ideologically than people who on a day in, day out basis have to actually confront human needs.
It feels good to be supported by everyone in the field. I think it takes courage to stand out. And that's why I'm so proud of our heterodox social work community because, every day we talk about how important it is to have dissenting opinions present in the classroom and present, of course, in our conversations as well, as far as what we think should be the future of social work. And so I think making education go in that direction and making it be truly heterodox would benefit the future of social work. I don't think anyone's acting in bad faith when we say that we want heterodoxy in social work. And I want to make it clear that the perception of liberal indoctrination cannot be combated with conservative indoctrination. Two wrongs don't make a right. If we think of a pendulum moving back and forth, it's when it's in the middle that the push and pull factors are the strongest. And that's why we have to be, and probably when I say we, I probably mean other disciplines too. I'm just not familiar with them. But we have to be very intentional in being moderate and centrist and being welcoming of all different ideas. Now, there are certainly dumb ideas and stupid ideas, but welcome them into the space in order to figure out how dumb or stupid they might be. But to shut the door before the conversations have even begun, I think we do ourselves a disservice.
Actually, you make a good point about making sure conservative indoctrination doesn't become the law of the land, because we're living in an age where the cultural pendulum seems to be swinging back to the right on some things, and I guess we should take stock of the fact that what's now called social work, for a very long time in more religious ages, social work ideology consisted of like go to church, get a job, find a husband, say the Lord's Prayer, and No booze, no drugs. Like, some of that, I guess, is good advice, but it was sort of, its own kind of puritanical conservative advice regarding social work, right? It's hard to imagine that universities would embrace that, but stranger things have happened. If people would like to find out more about your work with Heterodox Social Work, where can they go online?
They can go to Heterodox Academy's website, the community page, and they'll be able to find Heterodox Social Work right there. And we're certainly welcoming to new members as we continue to grow. And to touch on your last point, it that is a focal point of ours right now, is to assure that we don't have a conservative overcorrection if that's how things are seen. I try to walk the talk as I've presented on the importance, for example, of teaching critical race theory in classrooms, and also talked about how conservative perspectives should be included in the classroom as well. I think the classroom needs to be a brave space, not so much a safe space where emotions are coddled, as Jonathan Haidt would say, right? But a space where we're willing to offend each other for the purpose of learning, not just for the sake of offending each other, but for the purpose of learning. That's the last true safe space that we have, brave space that we have. So this way, once we graduate, we can go out into the world and understand what we're going to be looking at.
Dr. Nafees Alam, thank you so much for being on the Quillette podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.